Chapter 32 is looking at the 1920s from a political and economic perspective. So all of the things leading up to the Great Crash in 29 and then ultimately the Great Depression. Now, as I've mentioned before, the 1920s is almost this dichotomous era because on the one hand, you still see some holdovers of the progressive era, some movement towards changing society in the social aspects of it, but from the political and economic standpoint, the 1920s is very, very conservative. Remember, President Harding had won his election on, quote, return to normalcy, isolationism, laissez-faire, etc. So Warren G. Harding ushers in this new era of conservative presidents during the 1920s, and many historians actually consider him to be the worst president that we've ever had. Not necessarily for his political beliefs, but because there's a lot of corruption surrounding his administration. He is not necessarily the smartest man that's ever lived, and he relied heavily on his advisors or his Ohio gang that he brought with him from Ohio. Pretty much he was being used as by his party as a puppet for the other people within. So members within his cabinet, very, very conservative, old guard members of the Republican Party. People like Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State, Andrew Mellon as the Secretary of the Treasury, Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, and also he's going to be a future president in the 1920s as well. Albert Fall as Secretary of the Interior, which is kind of funny since he was an anti-conservationist. And Harry Doherty, probably the worst offender of anyone within Harding's administration for corruption as Attorney General. He had been the boss of Republican politics back in Ohio and had actually engineered Harding's election. So like I said, politically the 1920s are marked by conservatism, or a return to the way it used to be, or focusing on tradition, or less government involvement, laissez-faire. The government needs to keep its hands off. And one of the things that Harding did was to put in some very conservative members into the federal court. They are going to dominate the Supreme Court for the next 20 years. And even though we're going to see changes in the future, this conservative court is going to hang on for years and years and years. So the focus of these conservatives in the federal courts is to start cutting back on those progressive reforms that had been made in the previous generation. Such cases as Adkins versus Children's Hospital, this actually reversed a former ruling that the Supreme Court had made in Muller versus Oregon. Muller versus Oregon had actually given women special protection in the workplace. Adkins versus Children's Hospital now reversed that. They said now women have the right to vote, so therefore they don't need special protection in the workplace. They are now effectively equal to men. That was the Supreme Court's ruling in 1923. The War Industries Board was also dissolved during Harding's administration. Once again, the government is getting its hands out of business. It's cutting back on the role it plays in business like it had done during World War I. The Esch-Cummins Act, this was in 1920, and it returned private ownership back to the railroads. Railroads during World War I had actually been nationalized for the war effort, to ship supplies, to ship men, etc. for the war effort. This act returned those railroads to private ownership. It also encouraged the consolidation of many of these railroad companies as well, and the ICC is actually going to be engaging with the railroad companies at this time, helping them out of this. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920, also known as the Jones Act. Old World War I warships were sold off at low, low prices. It also required that any flagged ship by the United States had to be built in the United States. And the reason this is important is it is showing this renewed focus on isolationism. So not only are we returning to a laissez-faire economy here at home, but we are also focusing on staying out of international affairs. We are not in the business of getting into any more world wars, being dragged into European affairs. And it is a renewed emphasis on American industry here at home. Within the 1920s, politics and in the Supreme Court, there is absolutely an anti-labor atmosphere. Remember, this is a reaction against the previous progressive era that we've seen in the past. And in fact, in 1922, the Great Railway Strike of 1922 was going on for about 2 months when finally the Attorney General got an injunction from the courts against the strikers. It says this is a cease and desist order, basically telling the strikers either go back to work or else we're going to throw you in jail for refusing this injunction of the court. So this anti-labor atmosphere by the government, absolutely different from what we saw during the progressive era, results in a shrinking of labor union membership after the war by about 30%. So a completely different atmosphere compared to what we saw before. We also see 2 major new political action groups formed. The Veterans Bureau was formed to build hospitals and provide jobs for those veterans from the war. And then also the American Legion was formed, which we still obviously have today as well. The American Legion, this is a patriotic group, obviously mostly formed from World War I veterans, and they very much are against anti-radicalism, anti-communism, socialism, etc. So once again, showing this change in the 1920s. And then last but not least for this last slide is the creation of the Adjustment Compensation Act of 1924. Now here's the deal, and this is going to be very important later on. World War I veterans came home from the war and felt like they'd been duped. Here they were, they'd gone overseas, they'd fought for the war, etc. But meanwhile, men back home who stayed and had worked in the factories had made a lot of money working in the factories just because there was a lot of work to be done. So these veterans felt that they deserved what becomes known as a, quote, bonus. Basically, an adjusted compensation. They wanted more money that they'd lost from what they could have made during the war. This act would have given these servicemen money for lost wages, and in fact it would be about $3.5 billion that's going to be added to the war expense when all is said and done. Harding vetoed this, and later Coolidge vetoed this as well, but finally this was pushed through over these 2 vetoes. And the money that was to be paid to these veterans wasn't to come due until 1944. So 20 years from this time, they're looking to pay the veterans their bonus in the future. Now remember, a focus on a return to normalcy as we want to get away from what has just happened in World War I. World War I was terrible for the United States. Thousands upon thousands of men dead, pulled into a war that people are starting to realize was probably a mistake. And remember, the United States never officially joined the League of Nations. We never joined the World Court because we want to remain isolationist during the 1920s. And even though the United States is focusing on remaining isolationist, there are a few examples of them kind of sticking their toes into the international water, so to speak, kind of participating in some internationalism outside of the League of Nations. Now, we never officially ratified the Treaty of Versailles, so through a joint resolution of Congress, the official end to World War I came in 1921. We didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles, we basically just said war with the Central Powers is over. In 1922, the United States held the Washington Conference in 1922. Like I said, this is focusing on disarmament. This is a disarmament conference, and it is held outside of the League of Nations purview. And all the major naval powers of the world were invited to Washington, D.C. to participate in this conference. The Soviet Union was purposefully left out because the United States did not recognize their communist government. Out of the Washington Conference came several major treaties that shows, once again, the United States is somewhat sticking its toes in the international powers. For example, the 5-power treaty was signed between the 5 major powers that were at the Washington Conference: the United States, Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy. And what this did was it established a ratio for naval shipbuilding between those 5 countries. So it basically is saying if country A has built X amount of ships, country B is allowed to build X amount of ships. So it's creating a ratio for the amount of naval warships that we are allowed to have, trying to some degree to keep that military buildup down. The four-power treaty, also signed at the Washington conference, is looking to maintain the status quo in Asia, or keep things the way they've always been over in Asia, and that the countries of the world are agreeing not to seize each other's property over in Asia. Also, the United States and Great Britain promised not to build up their Asian holdings overseas as well. And then last but not least, the Nine-Power Treaty. Every country that was present at the Washington conference signed the Nine-Power Treaty, and basically it did several things. One, it agreed to uphold that open door policy that we've talked about before over in China, that we're not going to carve China up by their territory. It should be open for everyone to use economically. But the problem with the Nine-Power Treaty is there's no real enforcement capability other than using economic sanctions. So even though the United States is trying to get involved somewhat in international affairs with these different treaties, there's not really any teeth behind any of these treaties that we were signing with these other countries of the world. And worst of all of these offenders is the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. This is separate from the Washington Conference. This was another attempt by the United States to create some international law, once again, outside of the purview of the League of Nations. It was signed by Secretary of State under Coolidge. His name was Frank Kellogg, working with the French Foreign Minister Briand. The Kellogg-Briand Pact said that war is now illegal for anything other than defensive purposes. And 62 countries around the world signed this Kellogg-Briand Pact, promising that war would be illegal unless it was for defense. The problem with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, there is no way to enforce this. What are we going to do if a country actually violates this and goes to war with an offensive war? Nothing. We're not going to do anything. So really all the Kellogg-Briand Pact did was make Americans feel like they were safe from future wars. It didn't actually change anything, as we'll obviously see with World War II. Here you see that Washington Conference. Now, other areas to focus on in the 1920s when it comes to politics and the economy. The creation of the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922 increased our tariff to about 38.5%. The reason being is it's to protect American businesses from the recovering businesses over in Europe. We were worried that businesses growing up out of Europe would be able to undercut our American factories, and so we created this high tariff so that people are obviously more likely to buy American made products. But the problem with this is that Europe is recovering, like I said. They needed American markets for their recovery. So the fact that it's going to be difficult for them to sell their products and thus make money is also going to mean it's very difficult for these European countries to start paying back the debt that they owe the United States and other countries around the world as well. The fact that Europe really doesn't have any money, because like I said, they're still rebuilding after World War I was over, also meant that they were not going to be able to buy American made products as well. So we're not just looking to sell our products here in the United States, we're looking to also sell them overseas. And that's going to be difficult because, number one, Europeans don't have a lot of money. They haven't made any. They can't sell their products here in order to make money. And number two, Europe responded by creating their own high tariffs in retaliation. So you can't get away as a country with having an exorbitantly high tariff and not expect other countries of the world to respond with their own high tariff, which means nobody is selling pretty much their products internationally. And we started to see the spiral downward of the international economy. This is going to be part of the reason for the international Great Depression that's coming. Now, like I said, many historians today consider Harding to be one of the worst presidents we've ever had. Not for his political ideologies, but more the scandals that were going on around Harding and within his administration. And whether or not he knew what was going on is another story. Like I said, many people think he was pretty dim-witted as well. So several scandals to take a look at. Charles R. Forbes, who was the head of the Veterans Bureau, was actually caught at this time embezzling money from the Veterans Bureau, meaning skimming off the top. and taking kickbacks from construction companies to pick them to build the veterans hospitals. They weren't necessarily the best bid, but he was making a ton of money off of picking their company to build the veterans hospitals as opposed to the best bidder. For this, he received 2 years in jail and a fine. But probably the most famous of the scandals during Harding's administration is the Teapot Dome scandal. It's got a very cute name. In 1921, the Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, got the Secretary of the Navy to transfer oil fields that the Navy was using in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and also Elk Hills, California, to transfer them out of the Navy's purview to the Interior Department's purview. That's fine. That's not at all an issue whatsoever. The problem comes in then when Albert B. Fall took a $100,000 bribe from oil companies in order to lease these oil fields. They called it a personal loan from Edward Doney and Harry F. Sinclair. So the problem here is not the transfer of the oil fields. It's not even the leasing of these oil fields that was supposed to be in reserve for the Navy. It's the kickback that the Secretary of the Interior took for $100,000. He was also convicted of jury tampering during his trial as well. And the scandals don't stop there. His Attorney General, Harding's Attorney General, Harry Doherty as well, was also investigated in 1924 for taking kickbacks from bootleggers. Remember, bootleggers are the ones making illegal alcohol at this time. They never had enough evidence to convict him, but he did resign in disgrace. Now, by this point, 1923, Warren G. Harding, there's a lot of scandal going on around him. How much of it he knew, who knows? But he's looking to regain faith from the American people. And he went on a speaking tour across the United States known as the Voyage of Understanding to try to explain his policies and get people back on his side. He's actually the first president during this to travel to Alaska. But during this speaking tour in August of 1923, Warren G. Harding suddenly died of pneumonia and thrombosis, and his presidency very quickly comes to an end. And up next is Calvin Coolidge.